The air inside the concrete-walled basement felt colder than the January wind outside, and when the investigators' flashlight finally caught the edge of the sealed storage trunk, every sound seemed to stop, every breath suspended, as if the entire house was waiting for what they would uncover next that night. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The Kansas City winter of 1977 had already been defined by gray skies, freezing streets, and the quiet dread that accompanied a missing person case that refused to resolve itself. College student and part-time bookstore clerk, 22-year-old Elaine Mercer, had disappeared on an otherwise unremarkable Friday in early November. She walked out of her shift on Main Street at 6:03 p.m., crossed toward the bus stop outside the neon-lit diner known to every student in the area, and then was simply gone. No witness saw a struggle, no one heard a call for help, and no vehicle was noted pulling too close or too quickly. In the first days, her absence was treated as a possible deviation from routine, perhaps a spontaneous trip or a temporary separation from her schedule. Yet the Mercer family knew her patterns, knew her reliability, and when Saturday passed with no call and Sunday morning arrived with untouched belongings still neatly arranged in her apartment bedroom, their alarm transformed into certainty. Local law enforcement launched a standard missing person investigation with interviews, bus schedules, storefront cameras, and newspaper notices pinned to telephone poles along Troost Avenue and Grand Boulevard. Weather patterns were recorded, transit logs were examined, and early volunteer searches pushed through the brittle brush near Cliff Drive and the Missouri River bank. None of it generated meaningful direction. What began as an urgent search slipped into a quiet, gnawing stasis by December. The cold thickened, and with it the city's fear that the young woman would not be returning by her own will. Elaine was known to be composed, studious, and methodical. Her coursework at the University of Missouri, Kansas City reflected discipline, and her part-time job was consistently documented with punctual arrivals and clockouts. A forensic review of her apartment showed no damage, no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints beyond the expected circle of acquaintances, roommates, and family. Autopsy language would not be introduced for months, but the investigative tone shifted early. The longer she remained missing, the more the case weighted itself toward a grim statistical curve. Kansas City detectives combed through phone records, receipts, and sightings at the bookstore, each entry time-stamped and preserved in a manila file that would become thick with unanswered leads. The basement discovery that would ultimately crack the case did not happen until late January, more than 10 weeks after the disappearance. A neighbor's report of lingering chemical odors drifting from the furnace vent of a modest 2-story rental home on Benton Boulevard prompted a city inspection. The property, owned by a local landlord and occupied by a 34-year-old warehouse worker named Carl Whitman, appeared at first glance to be unremarkable. Whitman paid rent on time, rarely hosted guests, and worked overnight shifts in an industrial district. His employment records showed no disciplinary actions, no sudden resignations, no immediate flags. Yet neighbors described him as withdrawn, nocturnal, and obsessively private. That profile alone could never justify intrusion, but the odor complaint paired with an unregistered basement remodel submitted months earlier opened procedural space for a safety inspection. When police entered, they documented each surface with restraint and meticulous chronology. Basement dust patterns, tool placements, stacked crates, and electrical wiring were noted in handwritten logs and then transcribed onto official forms. What drew their attention was the locked trunk set deep against the concrete foundation. Its metal frame was sealed, its hinges reinforced, and its presence felt anomalously deliberate. The trunk was carried out of the residence under strict chain of custody protocol and transported to the police evidence facility. Inside, carefully wrapped and compressed, they found personal items belonging to Elaine: her bookstore name tag, her student ID, the canvas purse she had been wearing the evening she vanished, and several pieces of clothing folded with disturbing precision. Each object was catalogued, photographed, and cross-referenced with family statements and purchase records from the months leading up to her disappearance. The medical examiner's office would later confirm identification, and though the precise physical language is not required here, the official cause of death was documented as homicide. Toxicology results indicated a controlled sedative, not commonly prescribed and not sold over the counter in 1977, raising immediate prosecutorial relevance. Whitman had access to such compounds through a brief period of medical equipment delivery employment, traced through archived payroll slips and company logs. Investigators reconstructed timelines based on shift patterns, vehicle mileage entries, and Whitman's known routes through the city. The gradual convergence of travel data with Elaine's last recorded bus stop was not dramatic but persistent, a quiet alignment of geography and opportunity that pointed toward one suspect alone. Newspaper columns in the Kansas City Times tracked the case with careful language, describing Elaine's academic aspirations, her quiet routine, and the growing community unease. Flyers with her senior photo remained taped to convenience store doors even after the January discovery. Though explicit forensic detail remained sealed in court documents, the mood of the city shifted upon confirmation of the trunk contents. Local conversations moved from speculation to mourning, classrooms held brief memorial acknowledgments, and the bookstore posted a small notice in its front window thanking the community for its continued support of the Mercer family. Police interview summaries reflect a methodical progression. Coworkers described Elaine's final shift behavior as consistent with every previous week: calm, punctual, wearing the same winter coat and gloves she had taken to the bus stop for the early November chill. There was no sign of personal conflict, no abrupt change in demeanor. The prosecution team later argued that such baseline predictability made her vulnerable to someone who had observed her schedule long enough to anticipate her movements. Whitman's residence was situated 3 blocks from her bus line's regular path, and a forensic soil sample extracted from the hem of Elaine's coat fibers matched trace composition in the basement foundation mix, a detail considered subtle but powerful under evidentiary standards. Whitman's arrest occurred with minimal public spectacle. Detectives waited until laboratory confirmations reached threshold certainty. The court filings document location, time, and procedural adherence, including Miranda advisement and property seizure. During his booking, no confession was recorded, and he requested counsel immediately. Pretrial hearings stretched into late spring of 1978, with the defense attempting to exclude basement evidence on procedural grounds, arguing unlawful search. However, the city inspection order related to structural safety concerns, and the odor complaint was found valid, and the evidence chain remained intact. As trial testimony unfolded, Elaine's final movements were reconstructed not with dramatization, but with clear, chronological fact. Bus schedules, street lamp lighting conditions, and average pedestrian traffic density in early evening hours were presented by transportation specialists. Warehouse work logs established Whitman's presence near the transit corridor at the relevant time window. The jury, comprised of 9 women and 3 men, listened to 3 weeks of testimony in a wood-paneled courtroom on Oak Street, where dust motes drifted in slanted light above rows of silent spectators. No emotional outburst marked the proceedings, only quiet acknowledgments of procedural duty. The verdict, delivered in June, was unanimous: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase followed with the same restrained tone that had characterized the entire judicial process. The judge, referencing statutory guidelines of the era, imposed life imprisonment with eligibility for parole review only after several decades. Whitman's transfer to state custody closed the official record of the case, though public memory lingered in subdued forms. The Mercer family held a private ceremony, away from cameras and away from courthouse steps. A small scholarship fund was established at the university in Elaine's name, designated for students in literature studies, reflecting her quiet devotion to the bookstore shelves she once tended. Kansas City moved into the heat of July. Bus routes continued. Storefront lights flickered through routine closing hours, and winter's basement answer faded into archives. The concrete walls, the sealed trunk, and the January silence became notes in a closed file, preserved in climate-controlled storage, a resolved entry in the long index of cases that had once haunted the city's cold corridors of uncertainty. The conviction of Carl Whitman did not end discussions in law enforcement offices, nor did it immediately settle the deeper investigative questions that had grown around the case. Even after the sentencing, a quiet assembly of detectives, analysts, and assistant prosecutors continued reviewing the detailed operational notes, ensuring that every procedural step had remained within statutory boundaries and preserved evidentiary reliability. In Kansas City at that time, case closure did not simply mean conviction. It involved a full administrative evaluation to determine whether future disappearances could be responded to with greater efficiency. Elaine Mercer's file became part of an internal review that shaped subsequent missing person protocols in the region, prompting updated guidelines for earlier victim risk categorization when no contact is made within 24 hours. Weathered courthouse ledgers reveal how much the winter of 1977 became a reference point in municipal memory. Police training materials from early 1978 included anonymized case summaries that clearly mirrored the contours of the Mercer investigation. Young officers were instructed in the importance of neighborhood-level observation reports, such as odor complaints, utilities irregularities, and sudden tenant privacy shifts, even when no direct criminal suspicion was present. The trunk discovery, though formally tied to a lawful city inspection, demonstrated that case resolution sometimes results from auxiliary community data rather than direct witness testimony. In a metropolitan region that blended industrial zones with residential blocks, small details became leading indicators. The basement itself, after evidence was fully removed and structural safety confirmed, was sealed for a period before the landlord resumed usage. It never returned to its prior anonymity. Public curiosity never spilled into spectacle, but local awareness of that address on Benton Boulevard persisted. For months, people referenced it in low, careful tones, not with sensational language, but with the solemnity reserved for places that have transitioned from ordinary to historically fixed. Even as residents moved in and out of the adjacent properties, the memory of municipal vehicles, detectives, footsteps, and the heavy transport of a locked trunk remained embedded in neighborhood recollection. Midwestern winters have a way of compressing experience into silence. Streets empty earlier, storefront lights reflect on icy pavement, and home interiors grow still by late evening. Investigators later noted that Whitman's choice of timing, both in the abduction and subsequent concealment, aligned with this seasonal invisibility. Witness absence was not merely coincidence. It was shaped by the natural withdrawal of pedestrians from cold corridors. Prosecutorial analysis concluded that while Whitman had no documented pattern of violent criminal behavior prior to 1977, there were indicators of isolation, rigid routine, and a lack of long-term social ties that may have contributed to predatory planning. These were observations, not psychological diagnoses, recorded with restraint in post-trial commentary. Elaine's academic advisor submitted a written statement that became part of the university's internal records. It described her as committed to literature studies, punctual in essay submissions, and exhibiting a clear interest in archival work. The irony that her own file would later occupy a meticulously sealed archival drawer in the county facility was rarely spoken aloud, yet its presence was always implied. In the quiet campus library where she once organized return texts, a brass dedication plaque was installed near the circulation desk. There was no unveiling ceremony, no published announcement. It appeared one morning before the spring semester began, small and reserved, almost unnoticed until students paused long enough to read her name. Kansas City media coverage gradually diminished as other stories took precedence, yet the Mercer case retained a muted reference space in annual summaries of solved cold cases. Journalists sometimes mentioned it when discussing procedural reforms, especially in relation to missing adult classification standards. Prior to the late 1970s, there existed a frequent assumption that young adults who vanished, particularly those enrolled in college, might have done so voluntarily for personal or academic pressure-related reasons. Elaine's disappearance countered that narrative decisively. Her reliability profile, absence of interpersonal conflict indicators, and complete digital record silence, though limited to landline documentation and physical correspondence of the era, pointed to immediate victimization rather than voluntary detachment. In the police evidence building, climate-controlled storage cataloged every object connected to the investigation. Elaine's purse, carefully handled, remained sealed in archival packaging. Her student ID, bookstore name tag, and coat fibers accompanied the file, labeled and cross-referenced with laboratory reports that described material analysis in technical rather than emotional terms. The forensic report documenting sedative presence in tissue samples became central to the prosecution and would later be cited in training modules for controlled substance trace identification. The compound used was not common, and its acquisition required employment access or specialized knowledge. That detail, more than any single witness absence or neighborhood observation, tied Whitman to professional corridors where he once delivered equipment and briefly assisted in medical supply transportation. There were no public statements from Whitman after sentencing. His case file in the corrections system reflects regular compliance with institutional procedures, no disciplinary incidents of note, and minimal social interaction. His parole review eligibility, set decades beyond the trial, ensured that no immediate reconsideration of his confinement would occur. State records indicate that his name rarely surfaced in appeals discussions or legal petitions, suggesting either acceptance of verdict or resignation to lifelong containment. The legal closure was not dramatic, but it was final. Elaine's family reduced their physical presence in Kansas City after the trial's conclusion. Property records show they maintained ownership of their home for several years, but city directory listings indicate that by the early 1980s, a new name occupied the address. Their departure was not abrupt. It unfolded over seasons, gradually, with estate and academic paperwork processed at routine intervals. The scholarship fund, however, remained active. Not every recipient knew her story, nor did every award let her mention its origin, but those who researched its background encountered a precise entry in university records describing a life interrupted but not erased. Detectives assigned to the case were later reassigned to other departments and tasks. Some retired, others advanced into supervisory roles, and several contributed to procedural manuals shaped indirectly by this investigation. In interviews preserved in a regional legal journal, one investigator noted the significance of unglamorous work: door-to-door canvassing, utility report checks, property inspection requests, and environmental complaint documentation. What solved the case was not a sudden confession, anonymous tip, or dramatic chase. It was cumulative detail: the locked trunk, the neighborhood odor report, the employment access to medication, the soil match, and the absence of any alternative suspect whose timeline aligned with such precision. Winter eased into spring during the administrative wrap-up phase. Snowmelt revealed sidewalks previously outlined by search volunteers. Flyers slowly disappeared from storefront windows, either removed by owners or taken down by weather itself. The city returned to its measured rhythm, but the absence of Elaine's presence in libraries, bookstores, and campus hallways remained an unspoken marker. Cases like hers do not alter the outward structure of a city, but they change the internal register of how safety, routine, and predictability are understood. By late 1978, the Mercer file was stamped as resolved and transferred to long-term storage. Its pages retained the smell of carbon copies, courtroom transcripts, and typed investigative summaries. The trunk that once sat in Whitman's basement remained in state possession until evidence decommissioning protocols allowed its eventual release, though its interior contents, due to evidentiary significance, remained preserved indefinitely. The basement on Benton Boulevard eventually returned to ordinary function, but never to anonymity. A foundation is not simply concrete. It holds memory, even when unacknowledged. Elaine's story, resolved through method rather than spectacle, would remain there in the quiet, unlit corners of winter basements, campus libraries, bookstore aisles, courthouse archives, and city maps that once led her to a bus stop illuminated by a diner's fading neon sign. A final predictable moment in a life defined by routine before Kansas City learned what had waited beneath its own foundations. The years that followed the formal closure of the Mercer investigation illustrated the rhythm of American cold case resolution, as it existed before advanced forensic sequencing became common. Kansas City moved into new development phases, reworking highways, expanding municipal lines, and renovating aging storefronts that had once framed Elaine's final known walk down Main Street. Yet even as modernization progressed, the internal architecture of the Mercer case file remained untouched. Typewritten summaries, ink-stamped property logs, laboratory reports sealed in transparent archival sleeves, and the stark official record of a basement trunk that transformed uncertainty into evidence. That documentation became a reference point in discussions on how communities and systems quietly intersect in missing person inquiries, particularly those involving independent young adults whose routines are consistent enough to be traceable, but not monitored closely enough to draw immediate alarm when they fail to appear. As the 1980s unfolded, national conversations about victim rights, notification deadlines, and jurisdictional cooperation increased. Legislative review panels occasionally drew example cases from older Midwest files, including Mercer, to illustrate how administrative detail, not dramatic intervention, frequently defined success. The Kansas City District Attorney's Office retained internal copies of the chain of custody logs, using them as a training example of procedural clarity under conditions of extreme evidentiary sensitivity. Every object removed from the basement, every textile fragment, every lab test was accounted for with timed signatures and witness countersigning. The Mercer documentation became a model not because of its complexity, but because of its patience. Elaine's scholarship fund continued to operate quietly. Records show that over a period of decades, it supported students in literature, archival studies, and education, emphasizing the academic steadiness she was known for. Some recipients wrote letters of thanks to the family, unaware of the case's historical weight, focusing only on the opportunity offered by a name engraved on a plaque near the circulation desk on campus. Others, curious about that engraved name, researched it through back issues of the Kansas City Star and the local university paper, discovering a narrative that had been resolved but not erased. That subtle transmission of memory from one generation of students to another ensured that Elaine's identity was not limited to her final winter or to the basement where evidence concluded her timeline. Law enforcement interviews conducted years later with retired officers referenced the Mercer case with the measured tone common to professionals who had witnessed decades of procedural evolution. They spoke of the era before DNA indexing, before nationwide instant data sharing, before standardized Amber Alert structures, and before digital tracking could establish location chronology with precision. Elaine's investigation, they noted, represented the methodical, paper-dependent era of detective work. Interviews recorded on reel-to-reel tapes, typed statements on onion skin duplicates, and property submission cards stamped with month, day, and time. The case's closure proved that resolution did not require technological acceleration to reach judicial certainty. It required unbroken documentation, community observation, and adherence to process even when weeks passed without new leads. In the basement on Benton Boulevard, after city inspection clearance and landlord transition, the space underwent renovation. Flooring was resurfaced, electrical conduits replaced, and insulation upgraded to meet evolving safety codes. Yet those who lived nearby in subsequent years recalled the late-night vehicle presence during the winter of 1977 and the quiet, controlled transport of sealed evidence containers. Such recall was not expressed in sensational retellings, but in quiet acknowledgement of a historical moment that had crossed their street, intersecting ordinary life with the machinery of judicial procedure. No commemorative marker ever appeared, nor was one requested. The memory persisted not through display, but through archival permanence. Whitman remained in state custody throughout the decades, his file growing only with routine medical reports, facility transfer logs, and parole eligibility timeline updates. None of these developments altered the legal outcome nor threatened to reopen the case. His life inside the correction system was documented with the same precision that characterized the original investigative record: silent compliance, minimal communication, and no indication of appeal beyond initial defense motions. The absence of further litigation contributed to the case's stability, ensuring that Elaine's family, the investigators, and the city did not undergo renewed courtroom proceedings or media resurgence. Closure in this instance remained intact. University archives occasionally received inquiries from researchers cataloging regional criminal history. Mercer's file, referenced only by her name and scholarship foundation in educational documents, remained separate from official police holdings. Privacy standards ensured that student materials, course records, and personal correspondence were preserved respectfully. The section detailing her archival interests, class schedule, and noted aptitude for detail reading mirrored the quieter aspects of her life described by coworkers and family members. Reliability, order, routine. Those traits, consistent across all who spoke of her, formed the narrative's emotional center, not through dramatization but through quiet factual consistency. Kansas City grew outward, expanding into suburban stretches and renovation districts, yet the internal town geography of 1977 remained preserved in the Mercer file. The bookstore on Main Street, the bus stop illuminated by winter neon, the Benton Boulevard basement, the courthouse hearing room with high windows and static-charged winter light. Those coordinates maintained their relevance long after physical signage changed, after new tenants occupied buildings, and after newspaper archives transitioned from print to microfilm to digital scan. Cold case history, unlike urban development, does not erase foundational points. It records them. By the early 2000s, forensic science had advanced significantly, and many unsolved cases from the 1970s were re-entered into digital systems for re-evaluation. The Mercer case, however, required no reopening. Its forensic record held conclusively. Evidence integrity, laboratory analysis, toxicology confirmation, and timeline reconstruction had been sufficient by standards of both eras. New technology could have affirmed the original conclusions, but affirmation was unnecessary. In judicial terms, the case stood. The Mercer family name steadily receded from city directories and social listings. Their departure from public visibility was not abrupt but gradual, shaped by time, relocation, and the natural closure that follows final rulings. Yet their imprint remained in scholarship acknowledgments, archival catalog references, and periodic mentions in discussions of Kansas City's procedural evolution. Elaine's influence, largely academic in nature during her life, extended through educational support to students who would never know the winter streets she walked, the bookstore shelves she arranged, or the basement that held the answers to her disappearance. In the cold case division of the Kansas City Police Archives, the Mercer file occupies its place without marker or emphasis. It exists alongside hundreds of others, some solved, some unresolved, each insulated within regulated climate conditions and indexed by numeric code rather than emotional notation. The trunk, once central to the investigation, remains stored off-site in state-controlled evidence preservation, identified only by catalog number and chain of custody ledger. Nothing about its current placement evokes the tension of its discovery. It is simply an object in an inventory, stripped of narrative weight except when paired with the documents that defined its significance. The city, moved by seasons, weather shifts, and developing infrastructure, continues forward. Bus routes run past renovated buildings. Students cross campus walkways unaware of the earlier history that shaped missing person protocol, and basement structures throughout Kansas City stand silent, unremarkable, and unregistered in collective memory. Yet within the legal and archival structure of the Mercer case, every basement, every trunk, every winter evening bus stop maintains its position in a system designed to remember precisely when individuals cannot. That is how Kansas City, 1977, concluded not with sensational revelation but with lawful resolution. A basement sealed, a victim identified, a perpetrator convicted under procedural accuracy, and a quiet legacy sustained through scholarship and archived record. The answer, held in cold concrete and municipal documentation, never returned to anonymity. It remained, preserved in order and fact, long after the neon bus stop dimmed and winter left the city's streets.